Welcome back. You're watching Business Morning on Channels Television. In the last couple of months, since oil prices began its free fall, we've noticed that the currency, that is the local currency, the Naira, has been hard hit because most of our reserves is in the dollar. In fact, the reserves is in the dollar. And so the Central Bank of Nigeria has been trying as much as possible to provide some protection and boost the Naira. And the first time we saw the Central Bank of Nigeria doing a full devaluation of the Naira, a repricing of the Naira, was in November, and the second time was in February. And so over the months, a lot of market analysts have given the impression that the Central Bank of Nigeria should allow the market price the variation between the Naira and the dollar. But talking about how the economy is and looking at central banking in Nigeria with regards the policies, monetary policies and its actions, I'm being joined on the program at this time by Dr. Biodun Adedipe, who is an economist, to give us his thoughts on this. So good morning to you, Dr. Adedipe. Thank you so much for coming in.
Thank you for having me.
So listening to the last conversation I had with Okpeyemi, we're seeing that the Naira is being currently priced at the parallel market at between $269 and $271 to the 271 Naira to the dollar.
Yeah.
Give us your thoughts on that and then the state of the economy at this time.
All right, thank you so very much. Now, the first thing we need to address our minds to is that the demand for dollars here is not because people need dollar as a consumption item, but rather we call it derived demand, which means there are things people need, primarily they want to purchase, and that is why they need dollars in order to have access to those commodities. So which means then that the issue primarily is not with the Naira-dollar exchange rate, but those underlying commodities that people consume. Which means if you don't have sufficient commodities people want to consume available locally here, then we have to import them. And of course, this is underscored by the fact of the figures, that between January and June this year, we imported goods worth 8.765 trillion naira. Now, if you look at that, that simply tells you we still remain an economy that is hugely import dependent. So we can't escape the sort of things happening to us now, that the naira will keep losing value insofar as we keep depending on imports, both for capital goods required in production and also for finished goods that we regularly consume on a day-to-day basis. Now, situating that in context of the state of the economy, between January 2013 and June 2014, our economy was growing. But of course, this growth also, if you take it back to 2001, it had achieved an average of 6.4% average GDP growth rate for 15 years, all right? Now, we achieved that in an environment where we grew non-inclusively, which means we're growing, we're creating jobs offshore. And that's the major problem of our economy. So when you grow in that manner, you cause not only inequality, which of course is no different than what is happening around the world. Look at it today, 46% of the global wealth is in the hands of 1% of the world population. And it is even more worrisome when you look at Nigeria. So the issue now is, if you talk about devaluing the Naira, which is the sentiment most people have, look at the official rate today, 197 Naira to a dollar, and look at the roadside rate, 269 to 271. The sentiment commonly is devalue the Naira. But there's a question I always ask our policymakers, and that is, if you devalue the Naira today, with the lessons of history, who benefits? And this is my take on it. If you devalue the Naira, ideally your exports should become cheaper. And so that would mean you should be able to sell more to the rest of the world and generate foreign earnings. But at the same time, your imports will become more expensive. So the question now is, on which side are we in Nigeria? What do we export? We export primarily crude oil, condensate, associated gas, and over which you have no control on the volume as well as the price at which you sell. So if you devalue the Naira today, what should come to you as benefit from cheaper exports, you won't get it to start with. On the other side, you will make your imports more expensive, and that will create, of course, inflationary pressures.
So are you in support of the stance of the CBN's policies in recent
with
times?
respect to capital controls?
Yes.
I am firmly in support of it, and this is the logic. And of course, we have a reference also in history. Now, I had the privilege of doing some review of that, especially in emerging economies, in the last 30, 40 years. What happened? I singled out Malaysia. What did Malaysia do in 1997 when they found themselves in the situation Nigeria is today? Now, Malaysia introduced capital controls, like we have done today, but there is this missing element in us that existed in Malaysia. Now, in a review of that, what I would call a retrospective review by IMF, they picked out the fact that that policy succeeded in Malaysia because the bankers supported the central bank. Okay? But there is this mindset here in Nigeria that the regular person is looking for naira to weaken against the dollar, and so he or she is looking for dollars to get, so he can get a lot more naira for every dollar in his hand. So now, that was not the pattern in Malaysia. Now, every stakeholder worked along with the government at that instance. And so within the space of 1 year, by 1998, the Malaysian economy recovered, and also the stock market recovered. But that is missing in Nigeria because most of us, we don't look at the big picture. Rather, what we consider is what comes to me. So, and that is where the issue really lies. Capital controls is for a period of time. And that is what I want to advise the central bank to do. That I should not leave it open-ended as we are now. Let them tell us how long this will last. Once we know how long it will last, it is easy to get the cooperation of all the stakeholders. That's the key thing in this.
Yes, the stakeholders, including the banks, including the Bureau de Change operators,
right.
because just last week it reviewed its guidelines for Bureau de Change operators, that's why one of the many reasons why we're seeing what we're seeing right now. Do you support currency control removals? Argentina just did theirs this morning, removing currency control, and so allowing the markets kind of to price how the naira, or how its own currency is going to trade. Should that approach be looked at here in Nigeria as well?
And now, as we ask today, I will not advise that we remove capital controls now. Rather, what we should do is put a time limit on it. And my reason is this. Sometime in October 1992, this same argument came up. And I raised the question, who among us Nigerians will be glad to see the naira depreciate to 600 naira to $1, as it was in Ghana at that point in time? And of course, the entire hall was silent. So the question is, if you talk about the market freely determine the price, you don't have the capacity. Don't forget that as at Monday this week, external reserves at $29 was by far less than 4 months of our import bills.
$29 billion.
Okay? Now, that is on the one side. The other side to it is that even that $29 billion we saw is a moving average, which means the actual amount is likely to be less than that figure. So which means the capacity is not there anyway. If you talk about naira finding its free level in the market, this economy will go haywire. And of course, there are two critical things that I've noticed over the Nigerian economy in the last 40 years. Once the naira exchange value drops, it impacts commodity prices. And the other thing that impacts commodity prices is the pump head price of petroleum products. Every time since the 1960s that we said we will remove subsidy, it will impact prices. Of course, you remove it today. If your currency loses value, subsidy will come back again tomorrow. So it's an unending cycle. So the real fundamental issue to address is to produce here in Nigeria what we consume. That is what we should be talking about.
So what should the federal government, what advice would you be giving the federal government at this time?
My advice to the federal government is that, for me, they are going in the right direction in terms of the priority sectors. And how do I mean? If you look at the gross domestic product of Nigeria, there are 6 sectors that dominate economic activities in Nigeria. You pick out agriculture, you pick out ICT, you pick out manufacturing, you pick out mining and quarrying. Of course, a portion of that is oil and gas that we make so much noise about. Then you also have real estate, then trade. Now, those are the 6 major sectors, accounting for 77.7% of our economy, 2014. By September this year, those sectors accounted for 80% of our economy. So if the government will pay attention to those, what do we need to encourage activities there to produce more so that instead of depending, for example, on imported rice, we all begin to eat rice, cultivated and processed in Nigeria.
But Dr.
That will create jobs here.
Sorry to cut you there. This
Yes.
isn't the first time that this has been mentioned about trying to encourage more domestic production of
That's correct.
rice. But we still have this thing coming up on the front burner. Anytime they have to talk about, for instance, boosting agriculture sector, everybody always talks about rice and producing it domestically.
Now, I will give you a quick illustration on that. I had a situation where somebody applied for import duty waiver, rice importer in 2011.